Okay, so let's get started on our stacker ring project. The first thing that we want to do is we want to determine what size ring we need. If you have a ring sizer, you can use that to check to see what your ring size is. I know that my ring size is a 7, so I'll write that down. Ring size equals 7. What we want to do, because we will be stretching this ring through the hammering process, is we want to reduce it down to sizes. So I'm going to start with a ring size of 5. So start size equals 5. Now what I need to do is I need to determine what the inside diameter of my ring should be. And you can find many sources online to find out this information. I happen to use a site called ringsizes.co, and you can easily find what your ring size translates to in terms of inside diameter in millimeters. So I need a size 5, and that tells me that I need an inside diameter of 15.7. So I'm going to start with that inside diameter of 15.7. And these measurements are all in millimeters, and millimeters is a standard in jewelry making. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to determine the thickness of my wire. And to do this, the most accurate way is to use digital calipers. So they're very easy to use. Just turn them on, make sure they're set to 0. You can 0 them out if they're not. You can change typically between millimeters and inches using this little blue button at the top. Mine is already set to millimeters. So now I just need to measure my wire. So just close those jaws down, and mine is measuring at 1.63. And I happen to know that 1.63 is the actual size of a 14 gauge wire. So I'm going to add that 1.63 to my inside diameter. All right, and let's get our calculator here. All right, so we've got 15.7 plus 1.63, and that gives us 17.33. All right, so one more step, and that is to determine the length of wire based on these measurements. And in order to do that, we need to convert that inside diameter to a circumference. And we do that by timesing this amount by pi. And pi is 3.142. So 17.33 times 3.142 gives us 54.45. And to make it easy, we're going to round it up to 55 millimeters. Okay, so that is the measurement of the wire that we need to use in order to get to a size 5 ring, our starting size. All right, so you want to make sure that you have a ruler that gives you measurements, and you'll see that this one is in centimeters. Every centimeter is equal to 10 millimeters. So if I need 55 millimeters, then I'm going to go 5.5 centimeters. Pretty easy. But first what I want to do is I want to prep my wire before I mark that measurement and cut for that measurement. And so we can easily do that with these flush cutters. So right now, I don't know if you can see that, right now it's got a pretty pointed end, and we need to get rid of that pointed end. We need to make it as flat as possible. So we can come in here with the flush cutters and cut the end of that straight as possible. All right. It's going to leave us with just a little bit of a lip or a burr, and we just need to file that down. So I talked about using a half round file. What's nice about this file is it's half round on one side, it's flat on the other. So I'm going to use the flat side to just come in here and clean off that burr that's left by the flush cutters. And it shouldn't take a whole lot of attention. Alright, so that's all there was to it. And you can feel around to see if there's a little burr left. There's a little bit of one, not much. Knock that down. Alright, so now our wire is ready for us to measure it out. But we need to make sure that the wire is as straight as possible to get an accurate measurement. You don't want to go putting a curved wire on here because then it's going to be off. And just a little bit off, just a millimeter, can make a big difference in your ring size. So you want to be as precise as possible. So this is pretty soft wire. This is dead soft wire, so it's not hard for me to straighten it out with my fingers. You could also use some pliers. I have like some really nice parallel pliers that kind of makes it easy to straighten this wire out. And you can also use your bench block and a rawhide mallet to flatten it out as well. Alright, so we've got this pretty well straightened out. So now we want to come in here and we want to measure out 55 millimeters. Alright, so we've got that measurement lines up right there, and my mark is going to start here. It doesn't go all the way to the end of my ruler, so pay attention to that. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to make a little mark with my marker so I know where to cut the other end. Okay, so I've got my mark made. You can see that. And I'll come in with my flush cutters, and I want to make sure that the flat side of the flush cutters is in toward the piece that I want to keep. So I'm just going to come just to the outside of that line, give myself a little bit of room to file, and then I'll clip it. And remember, you need to be wearing your safety glasses. Things like this can go flying, poke you in the eye, and you don't want to have that happen. So now we're going to clean up the end of this piece quickly. Shouldn't take much. Just leaves the slightest little edge or burr. Alright, so that's clean, and just run it around real quick to get rid of any burr that it might have kicked up. Alright, so there's my 55 millimeter piece of wire. And we're going to turn this into a ring shape so that we can solder those ends together before we start putting our texture on. In order to turn this round, you can use any number of pliers. So I've got these pliers. They're like bail making or wrap and taps, I think they're called sometimes. These can be used. You can see what the end looks like. I also have some half round. These are very handy for making for turning wire or for rounding the wire. And this is what I'll use. I think round nose pliers, most people have those. You can use those as well. So anything that can turn the wire round or make it rounded without leaving marks in it is what you want to use. So we're just going to start here at this end and start gently just rounding it. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to go to this other end and start rounding it as well. And we're going to just try and make these meet up in the middle. And you want to use, some time and patience with this. And you want to get it to where those ends meet up nicely and flush. And you don't have to have a perfect circle. In fact, a lot of people make this kind of D-ring shape because if the ends are filed flat, then you're not going to get a flush close, get it to close without kind of flattening it out. So I've got these ends together, but I don't know if you can see that. There's a little bit of a gap at the top. So we don't want any gap at all. So we need to finish, we need to work on this a little more to get this closed up. So what I like to do is come in with some little flat pliers like this. They're just flat. And kind of flatten that one little area. And that should bring those ends together. Alright, so that's exactly what we did. We brought those ends together. Now there's no gap there. No gap. And it looks good going this way. And it looks good going this way. So you don't want to step. You want it as smooth and meeting up and lining up as best as possible. Okay, so now that we have this formed, we are ready to solder this piece. I talked about solder earlier, and I am using hard solder for this application. And so when you get the solder, a lot of times it'll come in a coil like this. It's very hard to work with it this way. So what I like to do is I like to cut a length of wire off that's more manageable, and I will usually have hard, medium, and soft on my bench. So in order to be able to tell the difference between the three, because visually they look the same, I like to put a kink in the end of the solder wire. So this is hard. I have a single kink in it, single little fold in it. This one is my medium. It's a short piece. It's ready for, I'm just about ready to create a new piece. So I've got 2 folds in it, so that visually tells me that's a medium. And then this one has 3 folds in it. So this one tells me that it is easy. And you would use them in that order: 1, 2, and 3. First solder operation, second, third. Okay? But today we're going to use the hard solder. So because the solder is round, it can easily roll off of your charcoal block or your bench when you're trying to use it. So the best way to alleviate that is to flatten out the end of the solder. I've already flattened this one, but I'll show you how we would go about doing that. So in order to flatten the end, you just get your bench block and lay your wire down, and with a flat hammer you're just going to tap that end flat. And you don't want to like squish it to death. You just want to tap it so that it's flat, so that it doesn't roll off. And then we only need a little bit of solder. So we can just snip a little piece off on the end. So and there's the piece of solder that we're going to be using. Alright, so we'll move over to the bench where I have my soldering station set up, and then we'll get started soldering. Okay, so now that we have our ring formed, we're ready to solder it closed. And you see I have the ring here. And I'm going to use the flux that we talked about earlier in the video. So what you want to do is you want to flux just the area that you need the solder to flow in. So we just paint on a little bit of flux around that joint. Okay. And we cut a piece of solder earlier, but I'm going to cut another one. Just set this aside. And what you want to do is you want to clean your solder off before you use it. And that's what I use these little Scotch-Brite pads for. It just helps make sure that the solder is clean. You want everything clean before you solder. It will not flow properly if anything is dirty. Alright, so we're going to cut a little snippet off, and I'm going to cut a couple just in case I lose one. I have a tendency to do that from time to time. So I've got one here, set it to the side, and I'm going to cut another. Set it to the side. Alright, so what we're going to do is just place a little piece of solder down on our soldering block, on our charcoal block. Set it right there. I don't know if you can see that. And then I'm going to take the ring, and where the joint is, I want to place that directly over that little piece of solder. The ring is going to hold that solder in place. It doesn't blow away when you're heating it up. And you can see the ring will drop when that solder begins to flow. So I have my solder pick here handy in case I need it. And we'll get our torch and get that going. So I'm just using this the little benzomatic torch. That's all I need for this little ring. And I'm holding it in my non-dominant hand, and then I can use my solder pick if I need to reposition or to flip it over or anything like that. So I'll zoom in a little bit. Alright, so you want to just start heating the ring gently, going around in a circle to heat the whole thing. And you're not heating the solder directly, you're actually heating the piece itself. And you want that piece to come up to temperature. And you want both sides of where that solder seam is to be the same temperature. And as you're heating this, you want to keep that flame moving. And so I start to brush this flame up across that solder seam to coax that solder to flow. So there it's flown. It's flown like the bird. And then I like to flip it over and just make sure that that solder has come through on the other side. Okay, and I think that will do. Alright, so see how easy it was? That was really, really easy. Nothing to be afraid of. So we let this cool for just a moment. You don't want it glowing red when you put it in, when you quench it in water, and then you put it in your pickle pot. So you can see this is turned pretty dark, and we need to clean off all those oxides now, and we need to clean off that flux. The flux will leave like a glassy finish on top of it, so you want that pickle to remove all that gunky stuff. Alright, so we're going to quench it in our bowl of water, and you notice I'm using copper tongs. You always want to use copper tongs when you're using pickle. If you can't use steel or anything like that because it will contaminate your pickle. It'll plate your pieces actually, and they'll come out looking all pink, and that's not what we want. So we've quenched this in water, and then I'll put it in the pickle pot, and we'll come back and see what it looks like. So we've taken the piece out of the pickle. It was only in there for a few minutes. It doesn't take very long when it's heated, but hopefully you can see that solder seam now. So this piece is closed. It is soldered closed. It should be a very strong join. And now we just need to clean that excess solder off of the piece before we start to form it. Okay, now that we've got it soldered, we need to clean up that excess solder before we start to form it. So I just take the half round file that I used earlier and go, clean it out on the inside using the half round side and just get rid of that excess solder. You don't want to take away too much material, so you don't want to really start taking away the actual silver in the piece. You just want to get rid of that excess solder. So on the outside of it, or on the sides, we can use the flat side of the file. On the inside, we use the half round, and we just work at it to get that excess solder off. And this other side looks good, the top looks good, this side looks good. It's just this one little piece that we need to get that extra solder off of. We don't want to start hammering it with a lot of excess solder because it hammers it into the piece and then it's difficult to remove later. Alright, I think we've got all the excess off. Well, there might be a little bit. Alright, so I've also got some sanding sticks that will take away some of those scratches left by my file. So I can just kind of lightly sand over that with the buffing sticks and smooth it out a little bit before we start putting texture on this piece. Alright, I think we are good to go. So now that we have our ring soldered, now we can start to form it. The first thing that we need to do is we need to get it into a round shape, and you can just use your ring mandrel to shape it. I'm going to use my rawhide mallet to do this, and you just want to gently tap it round. I like to kind of brace it against my body and hold onto the back of the ring just to keep it from flying around, and then you just gently tap it to coax it into shape. You don't need to use like a ton of force here because the metal is really soft from the heat that you applied to it. It makes it soft again. So as I'm tapping this around, kind of pushing down on it, and I look at this, it's pretty rounded. Okay. So on this ring mandrel it's telling me it's a 5, which I know it's about 1/4 of a size off, so it's more like 5 1/4. And just from that little bit of stretching that we did, pounding that we did, it stretched it a little bit larger. So we've got it nice and round. And now comes the fun part where we can start applying a texture to it. So we can put a hammer texture on it using like this chasing hammer. we can put any type of texture on it, really. You can use a cross peen hammer and put like striations across it. For this one, we're going to use the chasing hammer because I want a hammered texture on this piece. So I can use either the smaller end or I can use the wider end. I actually like the wider end. It gives me a little bit larger facets on it, and it'll give it a faceted appearance, you'll see. So what you want to do is, just like when you were tapping around, you want to kind of hold it and you want to just start tapping it and applying the texture, going around and around. You don't want to stay in one spot too long, or else it'll flatten that part out more than the rest. So we just start tapping, and it is noisy. Sorry about that. Sometimes you can put like a sandbag or something underneath part of your mandrel to kind of help dampen the sound a bit. That didn't help much, did it? So I'm just tapping and going around. And you see it's already moving the ring size. So because it's actually making this bigger, you want to pay attention to how much this ring is stretching, because you don't want to go past the size that you need. This ring mandrel is 1/4 of a size off, so I'm going to go down to almost 6 3/4 so that I don't go past my 7, and I'll check it on my calibrated mandrel. Sometimes it gets caught up in those little grooves, so. So I'm already down at a 6 on this one, so I don't have a whole lot more to go. Getting pretty close. Alright, so it's showing me 6 3/4 on this ring mandrel. So I'm going to take it off and check it on my calibrated mandrel. And that's coming in right at a 7. I'm going to flip it over and make sure that it's consistently the same size, and that's also showing me a 7. So I'm at my size 7, and so I don't want to hammer this anymore because it will continue to stretch it. Alright, so if you look at this ring, it's not perfectly flat. It's kind of got a wave to it. So now we need to fix that. And the best way to do that is to get your little bench block, and you'll see it's, it kind of rocks on the block a little bit. So we just want to take our rubber mallet or your nylon mallet and just start to tap around the edge of that as you turn it. turn it over. Do the same. And that has flattened it right out. And doing that should not have changed the size of the ring. And it didn't. It's still showing us a 7. So now we have our faceted ring. And all we need to do now is the finish work. Let's see if you can see that. Facets in it. And as we polish it, those facets will become a little more noticeable. So I talked earlier about using sandpaper and polishing papers to finish out your ring. So that's what we're going to do now. So I like to start with just a wet dry sandpaper, and this one is just a 1000 grit. I think I picked it up at my automotive store, and it's pretty fine. So I like to use either a dowel or a pencil to wrap it around because I want to get to the inside of the ring. And I'm going to use this on the inside. I'm not going to use it on the outside. I'll use the polishing papers on the outside. I don't want to, you know, mess up those facets and put too many scratches in it. So this is just a little more coarse, and we're going to work on the inside of the ring. Sometimes you can get some little grooves on the inside of the ring when you're pounding on the mandrel. You'll get little scratches. So we just want to get rid of those. So we just carefully sand inside of the ring. And this is the tricky part because sometimes it's really hard to get a hold of or hold on to. It just wants to go everywhere. So just spend a little time sanding the inside of the ring. And just make sure there's no sharp edges that are left. Shouldn't be, because this started out as a round ring. So those edges are rounded already. If it were not rounded, if you say started with square wire, you would probably want to round the edges a bit so it was more comfortable to wear. Alright, so we've sanded the inside. It leaves kind of a satin finish. Alright, so the next step is to use these 3M polishing papers. And these are great. They come in a pretty big sheet, and I cut them into 4s. So this is the size that I'm left with. They've got 400 grit, 600 grit. We go up to 1200, 4000, 6000, and then the final one is 8000. So you want to progress through these in order. And the smaller the number, the coarser the paper. So we start with 400 since that's the coarsest. And I'm going to wrap this around a pencil, and I'm going to start with the inside of the ring again. And this is very well worn, but you know, they hold up for quite a long time. So I'll just, and this is more polishing that you're doing instead of sanding. And so for each paper that you progress to, you're taking out the scratches left by the previous paper. Same with sandpaper. Alright, so we're just going to go around the inside of this ring. And you'll notice as you progress through these papers, it'll get a little more shine to it with each one. Alright, so we've gone through. We still have a satin type finish. And so at this point I like to lay it flat on my bench block and work on the sides. So I just work in a circular motion while I'm holding the paper. Circular, you can do figure eights, but it's harder with the paper. because it wants to move on you. Alright, so you just hold it flat, circular motion. And we're just cleaning up the ring at this point. Alright, so now we can move on to the outside of the ring. And what's nice about the paper is it conforms to any shape. So I'm just going around the outside and polishing. The more time you spend on this, the better. I'm just going to progress through these fairly quickly. Alright, so now we go on to 600, and we repeat the process. So we wrap the 600 around the pencil, and I wrap at this end so the pencil point's not poking me. Alright, wrap it. And we'll work on the inside. And I'll progress through these papers, and then I'll come back when I'm on the last set of papers, which is the 8000 grit, and you can see what it looks like. Okay, I'm just finishing up with the next to the last sheet and working on the sides. And then on the outside, and just slowly progress through these sheets. I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's already looking shinier. And we still have one more to go. Alright, so last sheet. Wrap this around the pencil. And start with the inside. So I don't know if you can see the inside, but after progressing through to 8000, you have a really nice finish inside. Alright, so now let's finish up the sides. And flip it over the other side. There you go. See this nice shine? Not bad for just paper. And certainly if you have a rotary tool of some sort, like a flex shaft, there's all kinds of attachments, or not attachments, but accessories that you can get for that. Different polishing kits. And you can certainly use those. I'm just assuming that if you're a beginner, you probably don't have a lot of tools and you want to get started without spending a fortune. And so these papers are really nice and give you a nice finish. Takes just a little more elbow grease. Alright, So there's the finished ring after the last polishing paper, and you can see the facets reflect the light really well. And look, you've made your first ring. And if you look carefully, you shouldn't even be able to tell where that solder joint is. And it's very strong because we've hammered that. It's not going to crush on you unless you really try to crush it. But it's quite strong for such a thin ring. What's nice about these is you can wear them individually if you want just a dainty little ring. You can stack them with other rings, other stackers. Let's see. So you can stack them with other similar stackers if you want a uniform look for a little bit thicker band. If you've got different textures, so these are the striations made from the cross peen, you could even make sure I've got the right ring. You can mix and match for different looks. And you can also make stone set stackers as well. I'll show you some examples. So here's a rhodochrosite, and it's got that nice texture with the crossbeam hammer, and you can stack it with these little stacker bands, which makes for a totally different look. Here's another example, and this is a faceted amethyst. It's actually a checkerboard. So, looks good by itself, but it changes the look up a little bit when you add little stackers to it. So there's a lot that you can do with this. And in the next video, we'll go over how to create this stone set stacker. So once you get this down, you can come back and learn how to do this one. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you learned something from it, got something out of it. I hope you go and try it for yourself, because I think you'll get hooked and want to do much more. So thanks for joining me, and happy torching.